Nice to see you.
Ditto.
Same for me.
Remember that she's going to be
Welcome.
Hey, good evening. First, I want to thank everybody who is participating out there in the public, and also thank our panelists on behalf of the NAACP, Commissioner Bard, City of Cambridge, State Representative Marjorie Decker, and Suffolk County DA Rachel Rollins. We're here tonight, as many of you all know. It's been a tumultuous time, both here locally in Cambridge and also in America, with the issues of race and policing. Not only has the issues that have come about since the death of George Floyd and others have shaken the nation, but it's also forced us at the NAACP to organize within our community to have a conversation with some key stakeholders and key people who we think can make a difference, and also shed some perspective on what's going on both at the local and national level around race, policing, and civil rights in America at this time. And so our program will run probably the time that it's allotted, but we do want to let you know that Suffolk County DA Rachel Rollins was gracious enough to give us an hour of her time, but she does have another engagement that she'll have to attend to right around the 7 o'clock hour, and that we're asking that if you have questions, you hold them to the end so that we can have them filtered into our panelists as we see fit. I think I'm going to start off by just quickly thanking the NAACP and thanking the Executive Board of the NAACP Cambridge, as well as CCTV and the Medical Task Force for sort of hosting this event. And we think that this is going to be an insightful conversation that hopefully will lead us to a place where we can think about solutions that will help our community be a better place to live, work, and raise a family, and also not dodge the hard questions and the hard conversations that have to come in these tumultuous times. So I'm going to start off with the first question. And as you know, my moderator, co-moderator, former Mayor Ken Reeves, president of the NAACP, we're going to kind of go back and forth and just let us know if you need us to repeat a question. So I'm just going to start for our esteemed guest. First, and you can answer it in any order, we're going to take a couple minutes. What was your reaction to the events that happened in Minneapolis, particularly and these are my words, the murder of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis Police Department? Please use your words, but what was your initial reaction? Commissioner, you want to start us off?
Sure. I was horrified. I thought that it was more than a tragedy. I thought that it was a depraved, callous murder. I thought that it should have never happened. There were enough individuals there, enough officers there to intervene and stop that bad behavior, and yet nothing happened. It moved me to, we got to do more than just talk about making change and hollow gestures. We have to do things to actually raise the cost for bad behavior and to make true reforms in our profession, the profession of law enforcement. So it like the American public, it cut me to my core.
Representative Decker, your perspective?
I think for me, it was like, when are we going to deal with this, right? What happened to George Floyd it's not the first time that it's happened to a person of color at the hands of police officers. You know, we have had for 400 years a state condoned violence predominantly aimed at people of color. And you know, you all know, and I know, Uri Stamps, right? Uri lived in Woodrow Wilson Court, where I lived. You know, yep. He was an elder of our community. It may not have happened to him in Cambridge, but it happened to him in Framingham. You know, and how many people of color who either aren't killed, right? And all of you can speak to this in a way, and I in a way that I can't, right? Have been treated in ways that, you know, made you hope that you would not actually be killed or be hurt, or humiliated you. And when are we gonna, I almost swore, sorry. When are we gonna actually really do something about this? When will it actually stop being okay? And so for me, it's a seething anger, and it's, when will this stop being okay? And can we start talking about the truth? And what has come out of that, and I'll stop because I know you have other questions that we'll get to this, but what has come out of that, people are home and people have time. And the perfect storm has been that who this pandemic has hit, and the fact that people have time and have taken to the streets, because we've seen it on social media. This is not the first video. And so that instead of continuing to be desensitized or despondent, like here we go again, people are saying, no, it's really enough. It's really enough. And I have hope that big structural change is going to take place, and it's coming in partly like a tornado, but then it's going to take a long time. I mean, it's like we need to do what we need to do now and seize the momentum. But this has to, we have to use these lenses of state violence against people of color through everything that we do. Everything, because it's in everything. It's in our schools, it's in our climate policies, it's in our healthcare outcomes. So I think for me it was anger, and with, okay, are we ready to really reconcile and make some big powerful changes?
President Reeves. I think he's muted.
He is. He needs to look up.
You're muted. Muted.
Unmute. Okay. Sorry. I was just going to say we'll move ahead, and when the DA appears, we'll add her into that question as the third respondent to it. So the next question is that there is a consensus across the country that the culture of policing in America needs to be dismantled and reconstructed. What is your opinion on this issue, and what are some of the reforms that are necessary immediately? I would start with you, Commissioner Barr.
So the culture can be problematic. We know that you can have policy for days, but the old saying that culture eats policy for breakfast is true. So you want to make sure that you do things such as raising the cost for bad behavior. You want to make sure that you implement policies that are reform-minded, but that are protective of the public, particularly protective of minority communities, Black and brown people. The culture of policing is when you say that the criminal justice system is built upon racism, is many of us get indignant when we should be getting introspective. There's no meaningful way to move forward if you don't understand the true history of the profession, and even, to include the dark past of it. So we need to make sure that at every step that we take, that our policies are protective of the public. And when I say that, I mean that, like, just this year, in this state, in Massachusetts, we missed an opportunity to be protective of the public when we implemented the hands-free, the distracted driving statute. We know that anytime that you expand the pool from which law enforcement can stop individuals, then that means that people of color, Black and brown people, are going to be disproportionately impacted, disparately impacted. And yet we didn't tie data collection to it explicitly when we know that we need to monitor and have policies that are protected. We didn't take the opportunity to be protected there. And individuals are going to suffer because we didn't take that opportunity.
Brother Reeves.
I'll get the hang of it, I promise. The question of whether or not police departments should be defunded is a major question that hangs in the air. Commissioner, what is your thinking on that question?
So defund, it depends on what, if you mean abolish, I really don't think there's much scholarly support or historical, theoretical support for abolishing. If you mean reallocating, then maybe there's a thoughtful conversation that needs to be had around that. And if you mean reform, then that's an absolute certainty. We know that reform is necessary. Reform has been necessary. I mean, history repeats itself, and this time I'm hoping that it's different. But, you know, I think most of us were around or understand that, you know, what happened in the 60s. And, you know, civil unrest leads to national report, a commission, the Kerner Commission report. It lays out things that need to be done. We do a very few of them, and then that cycle repeats itself. You go to 90s, the same thing. Then you go to 2014, the same thing happened. I'm hoping that this time is different. I'm hoping that that groundswell you hear never dies, that it keeps going until something has changed, has you know, actually occurred. The history shows us that it doesn't. So I'm hoping that this time is different.
Representative Decker, can you respond to that question as well?
So I think that it's, are you asking both? You asked two questions. Are you asking me to, which one?
You can do both if you like.
So I think it is really important to examine what police budgets look like and why they have existed. You know, Ken, you and I have voted for many police budgets over a long period. And I think it's important to look at what are the roots behind those budgets, and to start taking a critical look at whether or not it's time to start pulling out things that we've asked the police department to do that maybe we really should have been investing in more human service workers to do, right? So I think it's this, I don't think it's you know, an easy answer. I think what's easy about it is to say, we need to take a serious deep dive and start looking at what budgets, what are the values of these budgets, and what are they enabling people to do? We wouldn't have to spend so much money on building trusting relationships with police officers and young people of color if those relationships were never broken to begin with, right? And so that's, I think, about the budgets you and I voted on and some of the programming. And maybe the programming is really important, but maybe that programming needs to happen somewhere else. And I'd say it probably does. I've also, for years and years, I've talked to friends of ours in the police department, and I used to say, imagine if police departments went to schools of social work to recruit police officers. Like, imagine that's who was going to the academy. And I really applaud the commissioner for also really developing his own academy, and so that he can really control the narrative of what the values are and what the expectations are. But I do think it's important to have a more thorough look and to recognize that it's this complicated place where we continue to throw money at the police department to continue to make up for to make up for relationships and trust that were frail, as opposed to saying, wait a minute, let's pull back and see that, you know, this needs to be happening somewhere else. And why are those relationships frail? Let's call that out. And let's do that. So I do think that that is an important examination, and it needs to be done, I think, in concert, thoughtfully, informed, with people who understand policing, and community people and community leaders and academics who understand the values that we're trying to actually, what the results are, so that when we change those budgets, we're not left with necessarily just a smaller department that's continuing to be flawed and racist and hurting sane people. But it's really transformed. And I think one of the things that I have hope for in the short term and then in the long term is, I think that while training is important, it's really important, I think consequences are equally important, and if not more important. And there's legislation pending right now that looks like is being fast-tracked that's going to start holding a professional level of accountability. It's going to collect data. It's going to share data with the Department of Public Health, with the state, and there's going to be consequences. And you know, people in Cambridge who don't know this, people should know that I am really grateful that I have, since Commissioner Bard has come here, I have asked him to weigh in on a number of bills because of his lenses and the academic work that he has done in his dissertation, and helping me navigate how do we have better, more just laws as I've gone along. So he's been an important source for me. And I've seen him be a lonely voice in the Association of Police Chiefs around the state, where he has spoken spoken power to truth to power, and has stood alone, and doesn't care either. It's what has driven him. So he has been invaluable to me in helping me to think through sort of where I know we need to be on statewide bills.
Okay.
Welcome, Rachel Rollins, Suffolk County DA. Welcome. Good to see you. We want to
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Into the conversation by just
Yeah.
kind of asking one question that we ask all the panelists, and then we'll give you a crack at another question. But the first question for you was, what was your reaction to the murder of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis police? Those are my words, but what's your opinion to share with the audience tonight of when you first heard and saw the tape?
Yeah, just shock and outrage, profound sorrow, and just disgust. I made a statement with the mayor very shortly after that happened, and I think I was very raw and honest about my feelings. I think I spoke. We are fully capable of speaking on our own, and we certainly as Black people are not a monolith, but I think I spoke for many people of color, in particular Black and brown people, that day. I think it was June 1st with the mayor, when I said we're disgusted and I'm exhausted. And Richard, I will call you Mr. Harding and not the name that I usually do, Moki, is what I can tell you is it was not just George Floyd. This is just the most recent iteration of batches of murders that we've seen. This bunch of Black people include Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, David McAtee, and the other end of that spectrum is, of course, Christian Cooper in New York, in the BRANVILLE, as well as Omar Jimenez, who's a CNN reporter. Christian and Omar lived through their encounters, but just the Black experience. And I won't only say male, although it is predominantly male. Breonna Taylor and her family are survivors of homicide now. Remember, that, of course, was a no-knock warrant where the individual they were looking for had already been arrested earlier in the day. And I was just speaking with some electeds of color just a few moments ago about no-knock warrants. Like the police chief will tell you, there are certain circumstances where they are appropriate, with homicide, with hostage situations, with ever-evolving moments. But if any of you have ever had a surgery and you were supposed to get your right shoulder operated on, before you go in, you have to sign sheets of paper that say it's your right shoulder, right? They take a Sharpie, they circle your right shoulder so that you don't come out with like a new set of teeth when you went in for, a lower spinal surgery or something, right? The police need to start employing some of these tactics. If they are looking for Marjorie Decker, before they kick down a door, they need to call all of their law, and they will never be looking for Marjorie Decker, by the way. But I'm just saying, hypothetically, if they ever do, they need to call all of their law enforcement partners. They need to check every single database to make sure Marjorie is not sitting in Cambridge in a holding cell somewhere when they kicked down Richard Harding's door with a no-knock warrant. And what happened with Breonna Taylor is they didn't knock. They kicked open the door. Her boyfriend, who had a license to carry, because Black people, the Second Amendment applies to us too. We can have guns as well and not be criminals. Returned or started shooting, and the police shot back and killed Breonna, and the person they were looking for had been arrested earlier that day. So to answer that question, it was a terrible group of weeks. And I think that's why we are seeing this uprising that is not just exclusively in Minneapolis, or Georgia. It is across the nation and, quite frankly, the globe.
Thank you. Just to the other question, if you want to chime in just quickly. So as you know, and I'll say it a little differently, but the defund police movement is sweeping across the country. Both the commissioner and the state representative have given us some pearls of wisdom in their thoughts about it. What's your take on the defunding of police here locally, understanding the movement that's happening across the country?
Right. So I think I just echo the words of what the fabulous Cambridge police chief has said. Look, I've only been DA for 17 months. I have had numerous homicides that I have shown up at the scene on. We do need the police, but we're asking the police to do far too much, as the representative has said, right? We need social workers. We need mental health clinicians. We need other people that are deployed for non-violent, non-serious situations where people are in crisis. And I don't think individuals with guns, right, should respond. For example, even, I don't know if Chief, you were here yet, but the young man that was in crisis in Cambridge at Harvard University that was either having a mental health breakdown or a possibly substance use issue, who was naked in the middle of the road. Luckily, he lived through that encounter, but we need to deploy different people. Also, I think we need to talk about militarizing of the police departments and that money. But when Boston Police has a budget of $414 million, not including $60 million for overtime, we cut corners all the time for education. We cut corners all the time for the Boston Public Health Commission, which the Boston Police Department makes 4 times more money than. We need to certainly reallocate funding, but I do not support, a situation where there are no members of law enforcement helping us. I am telling you, as the DA, we need them, but we need to reimagine what this is going to look like.
Thank you. Thank you. You want to move to question 4, President?
Yeah. Question 5. Okay. There seems to be a weaponization of Black fear perpetuated by police and some white people all across America. Example, as the DA just stated, Chris Cooper and the calling / cookout Karen incidents. Some would say that these incidents lead to Black lives being put at risk. What is your opinion of this? And please share any solutions you think that could change the dynamic. Now, I do want to say with this, we invited Chris Cooper, who is an old friend of mine from Harvard, to be with us today, but he is really just overwhelmed with the press responsibilities he has gotten. So we hope that as the NACP to have him back at another time. He's very familiar with Cambridge because he was at Phillips Brooks' house and was in the Cambridge Youth Enrichment Program, running a part of the program at Roosevelt Tower. So we just want you to know he has this connection. But what happened to him in the Bramble is an incredible instance of the use of race and the use of the telephone. I've begun to think that, for me, white women with telephones can be very problematic. So I'm wondering what our panel thinks of that particular incident and the ones like it, and how does one affect the Karen syndrome?
And just quickly, if I could just add, if we could also just touch on the whole, the defense seems to always be, I was afraid, I was scared of the Black person or Black man. So if you could touch on that as well. Commissioner Barr, do you want to take this?
I was hoping you started with somebody else for that one. I'll say, it's not a new phenomenon. I think folks have been weaponizing Black skin since before this was a country. So I don't think that that's anything new. I think that, you got a long historical trail of that. I think, Emmett Till died because he had Black skin and allegedly, whistled at a white woman. So this isn't new. I think that it's something that's been happening and been occurring. I think that I've been fortunate enough to know that a few incidents have happened here in Cambridge that never made the news, only because the officers recognized what it was as soon as they showed up to the scene and handled it appropriately. So it's not a new phenomenon. Just like, the what seems like an endless series of Black and brown men being caught on tape being, killed by police. That's not new either. We've been saying that police been moderately handling us for decades, centuries. And so it's not new. It's certainly not new. What's new is the ubiquity of cell phones and cameras, everybody walking around with one, and one on the side of every building. So these things are not new in the American culture. And once again, we have to raise the cost for bad behavior. Everybody. So when someone is doing that, like she clearly was when she called, I mean, she let you know, I'm going to tell him a black man is that, oh no, that's atrocious. And we need to raise the cost of doing that.
Absolutely. I will just jump in and say, I think it started in and of course, the woman who accused Emmett Till on her deathbed admitted it was a lie, right? So he's lynched and murdered as a result of a lie of this woman, right? But nonetheless, I think this all started, honestly, Mayor, with Rodney King on March 3rd, 1991, which is my birthday. I will never forget the day. It was my 20th birthday, but where I think many communities got a glimpse into what many other communities knew was happening constantly, right? It's just that we got the first opportunity to see it. And look, guys, the police have been getting the business from the world right now, but I need you guys to hear that my profession is failing just as much, if not more, than the police, because district attorneys, all right, are supposed to be responsible for crimes committed by anyone. Citizens, residents, police, it does not matter who you are. And DAs have been completely complicit when we think about Richard and Ahmaud Arbery, where for 2 to 3 months, that murder happened, that lynching happened on February 23rd. We didn't hear about it until early May when a video leaked. 3 different DAs, Mayor, 3 different DAs looked at that tape of Ahmaud being shot to death by Travis McMichael and said, nope, this looks great. Georgia has a citizen's arrest statute. Totally fine. Until the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the sort of state version of the FBI in Georgia, came in, and within 24 hours, they arrested both McMichaels for felony murder, as well as their, I would call them, a joint venture, right? And I like to say out loud, the white people that are listening that say, like, this is outrageous, you wouldn't bat an eye. We do this with Black youth in Boston all the time. We charge them with joint ventures for less things every single day in the criminal legal system. So I will tell you, I think it should be a crime. The next most certainly relevant to us, think about Charles Stewart. Think about Susan Smith, the woman that killed all of her kids and blamed a fictitious Black man for allegedly stealing them and then killing them. Or Charles Stewart, which is a stain that remains in Boston to this day, the coward that murdered his pregnant wife and his son was born Christopher and died 17 days later. That domestic violence, double homicide, he lied about a Black man, and Mission Hill is still reeling from the invasion by the Boston police that happened there. It needs to be a crime. I don't care about, Miss Amy Cooper's tears and, sorry, I feel really bad and I'm reading the new Jim Crow. You need to be charged with the crime. Because the same way that these broken windows people love telling me Black kids need to be held accountable for their crap. You know what? These young Black children and brown children and poor children didn't have any opportunity from the moment they were born. They were put into a housing system with parents they didn't choose, an education system that's failing them. And a lot of these entitled white women or people that are doing this have had every opportunity in their life and are still making terrible decisions. It needs to be a crime.
Doctor.
Rachel, that's, it needs to be a crime. There needs to be consequences. We can talk about training and we can talk about like change of hearts and all this other stuff. It's a crime. When you frame this as the weaponizing of Black skin, what's being weaponized is white people who are using their own racist views of people of color. That's the weapon. Because I think of Teresa Lund. Let's talk about Teresa Lund, who is a director of a program at Harvard University, who starts chastising a young Cambridge woman who has a biracial child and assumes that she doesn't live in the same property that she does, because she couldn't possibly, why could she not possibly live there? Well, if you're racist, then that's why you can't live there, because only white people actually go to Harvard. Ken, we know that's not true. And of course, you know, Christian Cooper, I'll say that. But I will just say that there needs to be consequences. You think about what happened with Amy Cooper. You think about what happened with the woman who owns La Face Makeup in San Francisco, who stood there, I mean, white supremacy is, for me, the idea that white people feel emboldened, empowered to use lethal weapons of their racist views that can often lead to either physical violence and death or emotional scars that are just as traumatizing. This woman stood there telling this man, I know who lives in your home. You know, and again, it's that smile of that, it's that pretend, like, passive, like liberal, good, you know, white person. I'm just looking out for the neighborhood, right? Yeah. So fragile feelings, they're not fragile, they're not tears. The tears are, oh shit, I got caught being a complete, total racist. And the truth is, you can't be born in this country and not be a person of color and not be racist, right? You're born not racist, but we learn very quickly, even those of us who have kind, loving parents who want us to accept people who are not white and have our diversity thing, we learn over and over, because racism and white supremacy is taught every single day, because we've never addressed where it has disenfranchised people systemically from the roots of slavery. So without consequences, without recognizing the weaponizing is, their racist entitled views lead too often to physical trauma, but just as importantly, emotional trauma. That has to be a crime, because it is a crime in so many other instances.
You know, I've been wondering, Marjorie, how the Karen syndrome would be viewed by you in particular, because I know you have
white skin. She has white skin, beautiful white skin.
The thing I do want to add, we are the Cambridge NAACP, and people might think all of these questions are, you know, either in New York or in Minneapolis. I would say this, and I'm a moderator, so I can't participate in the discussion, but I had my own Karen experience late last year on Hancock Street, when I stopped to look at some new landscaping on that street. And I heard a voice that said to me, do you have a problem? And this is late evening. And I said, do I have a problem? And it was an older white woman. And she says, yes, because you're staring at me. And I very quickly, I will use the little brain I have, said to myself, you should pick up your bag and walk away, because this woman is 2 seconds from being on the phone about something you didn't do to her. But it was in a flash. But people do not believe that in Cambridge, certain things happen. And I just wanted to make a testimony that they do very much happen in our city and in our society, because we've become sick, fully sick.
Can I'll just say that not only they happen in every neighborhood in Cambridge, but I think the other crime here, and I know that this will get, you know, at least you and Richard going, so I'll try to pull back quickly, but they're happening in our schools every day. How do Black boys in Cambridge public schools get expelled and suspended? And we're talking about elementary and middle schools. And I think about children who I know who've been in moments where their white teacher had to report them, because the rules say, if I bump up against you, I have to report you. And the teacher says at an expulsion hearing, I never felt threatened. I had to just follow through the rules. The child is crying. No one believes that child was ever trying to hurt that teacher, including the teacher, and yet he still gets expelled. And by the way, the teacher violates the actual understanding of the children's IEPs. And it's not a one-time situation. Or I think of elementary school. I think of another family that I know, and this mom was not playing. She actually, they underestimated that she understood the rules when they tried to get her to sign a piece of paper that her third grader was going to be expelled. And she knew she was entitled to a hearing. And so I just think that it happens every day in Cambridge, because Cambridge is not immune to being part of a white supremacist racist system. And so it's got to be about consequences and about ripping apart the systems that enable this, and a real honest look. And some of us are going to lose opportunities and privilege, but need to be at the table leading that.
Can I make a clarifying comment there?
Sure.
And in the Cambridge school system, that's not. She's talking about school interventions. We don't arrest juveniles. We favor prevention, intervention, and diversion. We understand here in Cambridge that if you put a young person in contact with the juvenile justice system, that they're 7 times more likely to be involved with the criminal justice system as an adult. So therefore, it just makes every sense in the world not to involve them in the juvenile justice system. So through something that we call the Safety Net Collaborative, which is a partnership with the schools, Department of Human Service Programs, and Cambridge Health Alliance, we don't arrest juveniles. We get instead get them wraparound services for the entire family. It's a very involved program that I'm very proud of. But just to be clear, that's not Cambridge Police or any of our
that's
youth
amazing.
resource officers.
And think about kids that are in DCF custody, right? Like when we think about, young people who many of you know, and my story is not a private one, that I have siblings that have struggled with mental health issues or substance use disorder, unfortunately have cycled in and out of the criminal legal system on
I raised my hand too.
Right, county, state, and federal system. And as a result of that, I'm the guardian of 2 of my nieces. I have a 7-year-old niece who is a little girl. She is 7, and she has me as her guardian. My parents are deeply in her life. She's in a great school at the Baldwin School, and she's acting out. And she has all these wraparound services. So imagine children, young boys and girls. And remember, Representative, Black girls and brown girls aren't faring too well either in these schools. Similarly, if you don't have a parental unit, we don't get to choose who we're born to, right? Believe me, if we did, I would be adopted by Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt right now and be living somewhere on an island if they were still together. But we don't get to choose that, right? You don't get to choose where you live, who your parents are, what your school system is. And these young people that are acting out sometimes have endured such trauma that it's just yet another societal failure of doing that. I will add, Mayor, you're right. I think the entitlement that I see with people, I was in Somerville District Court for one of my siblings. I had not become DA yet. And I was just sitting and there was no room to sit in the open area of the courtroom. And of course, if you've gone to law school, you can push that little door open and lawyers are allowed to sit up in the front area. And so, look, I have multiple degrees. So I pushed the door and sat my round hind parts down, and a court officer walked directly over to me to say, only lawyers can sit here. And I looked at him and said, oh, thank you. And looked back at what was happening. And he said, no, you have to be a lawyer to sit here. This was in 2019, America, 2019. And I said, right, I'm aware. And he said, ma'am, you need to get up. I don't want to make a scene out about this. And I said, no, what about you? What about me makes you think I'm not a lawyer? And he said, well, I've never seen you before. And I said, so you have seen every lawyer that's ever practiced law in Massachusetts? And he was like, no. And of course, I wouldn't get my bar card out. But honestly, the next person that came up and said it to me was my brother's court appointed counsel, right? Who I just looked and said, like, where am I? And this is why this system, and it wasn't that day. I mean, I knew I was going to win before that, but I'm like, please, I'm going to obliterate these fools and change all of this. I want to call out every entitled person in the world. And I was well-dressed, well-educated, in a good mood, so didn't make a scene. Imagine the people that are just picking up the pieces because they got a call that their loved one was arrested. They're scrambling to get bail money. It's just, we are treated so poorly in the system in every way. I think we need to start talking about it out loud.
Let me jump in with the next question, but I appreciate that. Before I jump in though, Commissioner Bart, if you want to, do you want to share your similar to D.A. Rowland's story when the reporter was looking for the police commissioner, or will we just?
Oh my God, I love you, Commissioner. Tell it.
If you don't have to though.
I need to hear it. No, I need to hear it right now.
Down here at the NAACP.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, only because you asked, but anyway, just to back up a few, just like the district attorney, I have folks, family members who've been embroiled in the criminal justice system. and in the throes of substance use disorder. My mother only has 2 sons. One of us is in jail for life, and the other one of us is running a police department. We both could be running companies, and we both could be in jail for life. You know, she didn't raise either of us differently, and it's just, you know, part of life and the hard life that we had. That story is the story about the reporter. Well, I can't even say what I was about to say. Anyway, my PIO, the Public Information Officer, set up an interview between me and this reporter as I was new here in Cambridge. He copied both of us on the emails where he attached my information and my picture and so forth, and that, you know, Commissioner Haas was no longer here, and that, in fact, it was Commissioner Bard that she would be meeting with. So we set up to meet in the lobby of my headquarters, the Bob Healy building, you know, police headquarters. And so I meet her there in the lobby, and we're standing there exchanging pleasantries. I'm like, are we doing it here? You want to do it in my office? She said, no, here is fine. And so we're standing there for a couple of seconds, you know, a pregnant pause, or whatever, unpleasant pause. And then she looks at me and she says, so are you going to go summon him? And I said, excuse me? She says, the police commissioner, are you going to summon him? And I said, okay, yeah, I'm the police commissioner, and I'm here meeting you to talk, you know, to do the interview. And she says, oh, I'm sorry. I'm used to Commissioner Haas. I thought Commissioner Haas was meeting me here. And rather than call her out on the email that I knew that she was a part of, and I just said, okay, well, it's me, and let's sit down and talk. So, you know.
So really quickly, let me jump into the next question, because I think this is an important one, because I think you all have talked about kind of people. I'm a true believer in we talk about this often, that, you know, all the training in the world, in my estimation, wouldn't have affected the mindset of Derek Chauvin when he stood on that man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. I think that while training is critically important in anything that we do, I think for me, it's more about, or as much for sure about the people. You have to hire, you have to train, you have to have good people in the roles when they're protecting, you know, folks, particularly as police officers. And I know DA Rollins talked about having empathy from her position in the DA's office. But, you know, I also believe that hurt people. So we have to just understand that. So the next question is, some people believe that training is one of the key factors to make sure that these tragic events that leave Black people dead never happen, while others believe that it's not its training as much as racist police officers who have no regard for Black humanity. That is the root cause of the problem. What is your opinion of this aspect of the issue? And I want you to just speak about, and as DA Rollins said, this is not, and you all said, this is not the first one, but I do think that for 8 minutes and 46 seconds for the world to watch, I think that was, for me at least, and I've seen almost all of these, whether it, you know, obviously we all have YouTube, but that was one of the most traumatic displays of callous violence that I've seen. In the bigger picture of Black men being shot in the back and all the other things, you know, Yuri Stamps, really quickly, because someone brought it up, you know, Yuri Stamps was laying down on his stomach, I believe, with handcuffs on, while his stepson was outside already in custody, and somehow, some way, you know, he ends up dead. So can you just speak to the lack of humanity that many people believe that, particularly law enforcement, because we're focusing on that now, but that people have for Black humanity? Who wants to start? Do you want to start, Separate Representative Decker?
Thanks. Yeah, I think that is important, right? I mean, Yuri was on his stomach. He was a threat to nobody. So how does he end up dead? And Richard, when you say, so I say to my kids all the time, hurt people, right? And that's true. And I think all of us in a variety of ways have committed our lives to trying to get to the roots of pain for people and injustice, especially when injustice is the reason, inequity is the root of that pain. The difference is police officers carry weapons that can end somebody's life in a heartbeat. So there needs to be a different standard, right? It's like, if you can't recognize that you made a mistake and that person standing on his porch really lives there, and his like sassy mouth pisses you off so much that it escalates, that's a problem around your ability to need better training as a police officer to understand that we actually rely on our police officers to be able to de-escalate. Ken and I were not good at de-escalating as city councilors, right? So I've always said I would be a terrible police officer. I would have such righteous indignation. I would be the worst kind of police officer. And so I know that that was never a calling for me to go into, because what it would allow me, the power it would allow me to hold over people can kill people and ruin people's lives. And so I think that when we talk about, and so by the way, for the police officers who are out there who have incredible restraint, right? And it's a calling, and we need to make sure that the right people are being called, not people who are trying to work out some pain, right? This is not the place to come to work out your pain, and to work out your reason of why you don't feel worthy in this world, or strong enough. And so I think it comes down to who, and I said this before you got on, Rachel, but I have said for over a decade about who we recruit to be police officers needs to be re-examined. We really need to be looking at who do we want in the police department? What makes a good police officer? I think it's about examining what we expect of the police department, and we've come to expect so many different skills that aren't necessarily in part of training. And I want to say that again, I hope people will take more time to actually learn. And Commissioner, I hope that you have more opportunities to talk about what you've done in Cambridge, because it has been really transformational, and it's what brought you to Cambridge. Early on, I recognized D.A. Rollins talked about the young man at Harvard who was having a mental health issue and was outside naked. You were here. This was your first couple of months. And one of the first things that you did was call for an independent investigation, right? Having police departments that are not afraid of eyes outside of their department actually assessing, and having police departments that are being led by people whose values know that you want to be doing the best, that you want all of your members having the best resources and the best values and the best tools. So I think training's a part of it, but it's about who we're training, who's overseeing that training, and then it's also about consequences. I will come back to this, whether it's licensing, decertification, rules around use of force, duty to intervene, all of those things. It's not going to be a one issue thing that gets us the police department that we deserve to have instead of the one we have, right? And so I think that it is like leaders like Commissioner Bard. It is having incredibly powerful DAs. It's people with life experience. It's having legislators who also are leading the charge and supporting those who are leading the charge. It's going to take a lot of things, but it's going to take a lot of, it's going to take all of this.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So for me, the police are the only branch of our government that have the lethal and legal authority to kill you without any oversight. They don't have to stop in the minute to make a phone call and explain what's happening. It is a very difficult job. It is life and death in certain circumstances. But we are the government, and we have to, right? If you have a chip on your shoulder and you hate the people that you are policing, get another job, right? I often ask, right? I have 5 Boston police detectives that work in my building. I also oversee the state police narcotics and body unit. You can be a state trooper in Massachusetts, but you cannot be in the Suffolk County body or narcotics unit without my approval, nor can you be in the Boston Police Department's homicide unit without my approval, right? And so my overwhelmingly white staff at the DA's office, and I know it's a loaded question, but I like asking, why do you want to work in an office where we prosecute more Black people than they represent in the total community? And if they are flustered by that question or somehow can't answer and say, whoa, 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 wait a minute, I'm interested in or give me some answer, then I don't think they're ready for the job. Same thing with all of the detectives or troopers that are coming in to speak with me. You know, I look at this and say, why do police officers want to police? Why do they want to work in the communities that are most often touched by police presence and prosecution? That's a great question that we need to start asking, right? If it's, I grew up in Mattapan, yes, it's different than where it is right now. Okay, we'll figure that out. But let me tell you something. If I find out you have racist emails or tweets or social media, go get a job at Denny's, okay? don't work for the police department, right? You're not going to be armed with the ability to kill us and dislike us immensely. The last thing I will say, and I am the daughter of a veteran, I am a proud daughter of a veteran, but we have to have a real honest discussion about veterans' preference, where this country sends people overseas to serve in combat. They get PTSD and then they come back, and we're talking about community policing. And what we need to do is either get the treatment that these individuals need when we give them PTSD by sending them away to war. But that is those are conflicting things, where we ask them to community police, but they are militarized with weapons, and then they are kicked back into situations where they think they're in combat. We have to start having real conversations about that. And then to the commissioner's point, I'm proud that had George Floyd happened here, I am the first DA in the United States of America that has what's called a discharge integrity team. So anytime there's an excessive force complaint or a discharge of their duty or their weapon, a taser, something, whether they live or die, the individual that comes into contact with the police, I have a community member, a criminal defense lawyer, a retired judge, and a member of law enforcement, and me. We are the 5 people on the discharge integrity team. We do not meet in my office. We meet out of my office once a month, and we do a thorough deep dive into each of those, because communities don't believe that if every day we go into court with the police in 95% of our cases, how am I going to now take my hat off and say, okay, I won't be biased anymore, even though we do this with them every day. That's why we set that up.
I'm a big proponent of that type of interdisciplinary review. I think it is more likely to yield results that are seen as legitimate, across all spectrums. So that's a good thing.
So really quickly to DA Rollins, I know you're moving soon, but I want to put this out there while you're here. We're going to have you answer this first. I know you all work with unions, particularly here in your respective positions. Can you speak to the what I'd say is a perspective steeped in a lot of real facts and we look at all of the, in officer involved shootings that I don't know one union that has come out, police union, and has categorically just said that, this officer really, messed up, and that we support the community or the process to happen in a way that was honest and genuine and authentic. And I say that because something that you said, DA Rollins, police have to understand that they're guardians and not warriors. And so can you just speak to the union's role in this? And I'm going to say that the public thinks it's a negative role, that they're hindering justice in many cases.
So I'm the proud daughter of 2 union members. So I'm not in any way implying that we should be union busting. We need strong unions. But I recently got into a little bit of a, Twitter war, I guess, for lack of a better word, because I mean, I can take the punch from you. Let me tell you that.
It wasn't just on Twitter.
Yeah, anywhere to bring it, and I will respond. But my point is Commissioner Gross immediately stated after George Floyd that Derek Chauvin, and I will not call him an officer because that dishonors the word officer, and there are too many good men and women that do this job with dignity every day, but immediately denounced Derek Chauvin, immediately said that this is criminal and he should be charged. And I'm a member of NOBLE, along with the Commissioner Bard as well, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Officers. We issued a statement immediately denouncing what happened. And my whole point, though, was Commissioner Bard and Commissioner Gross are management. You know what Commissioner Bard isn't doing? He's not working a 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift or whatever the time is, knocking doors in Washington Elms, right? Or for me, I live in Roxbury now, in B2 or in the gang unit, the rank and file are the ones that come into contact with the community every day. And my point was, the silence is deafening from the Boston Police Patrolmen's Association. I just want them to say, we denounce what happened. We stand with our community and are proud to serve. I don't even need an apology. All I need is to know that you watch that and you find it outrageous, because right now silence is assent. And B, Richard Harding, Ben and Jerry's issued a statement denouncing George Floyd's murder. You know who else did? Zappos, right? When I'm ordering fabulous shoes in the middle of the night, they tell me Black Lives Matter and that we don't stand with George Floyd or Derek Chauvin, or we stand with George Floyd and against Derek Chauvin. McDonald's, you can't get fries without somebody saying, you know, here's your fries, Black Lives Matter. We hate Derek Chauvin, whatever, right? But our police associations, their heels are so dug in that they refuse to just say, yeah, that's not us, right? And for me, this overwhelmingly white organization is just tone deaf. And I don't care whether they like me or not. That's not why I didn't take this job or run for this position to make new friends. I ran for it to make change. And what I'm telling you, Commissioner, and you know this, change is coming. We need you at the table, but you can't be acting a fool and, you know, supporting people that have racist texts and backgrounds and think that we're going to take you seriously. You need to, if you've watched, you know, Remember the Titans, attitude reflects leadership, right? We need you to stand up and these bad apples you're talking about, root them out and get rid of them. We need Keisha Lance Bottoms out here firing people immediately and saying, yes, we know you have a union. Work on it for the next 2 years to try to go through each step of your grievance procedure. Then we have to agree on an arbitrator. Then we have to get a date. Then we have to have the arbitration. Then we have to wait for the ruling. Then we get to appeal. But in that instance, you aren't an employee anymore, right? I know it's different in Massachusetts with civil service, but we need bold leadership that's going to nip this in the bud the second it happens.
Commissioner?
So, yeah, one of the things that was and is promising is that so many police chiefs spoke out right away against the murder of Mr. Floyd. And you did see some unions across the country say, you know, we can't support that and make statements to that effect. And I have
and I want to say the Boston Police Detectives Union, I think, made a statement. So it's not all unions. I'm proud of them. Of course, they have a Black president, but nonetheless, I digress for a minute. Go ahead.
And I have seen in the past some unions, particularly back in Philadelphia, where the union who was notorious for fighting for the rights of their members, whether they are wrong or right, but come out right away and say, we're not defending that officer for this particular incident and walk away from them. So I have seen it, and it's more encouraging that you're seeing it more and more. But the fact of the matter is that it goes against trust building when we do things. We only hurt ourselves as a profession when we're out there seen as fighting efforts to hold us accountable, when we're seen as fighting efforts to check our authority. You know, there's you know, truth to that. Absolute power corrupts, absolutely. And at all times, power needs to be checked. I don't care who holds it. The longer you hold it, unchecked, the more likely you are to abuse it without forethought. So when we do things like that, we hurt ourselves, and we make it harder for each and every individual police officer to perform their jobs. And that's what I tell the men and women of the Cambridge Police Department, by being transparent, by subjecting yourself, submitting to the checks on your power. You're only making it easier for yourself. You get to credibly say, not here in Cambridge. That doesn't happen here in Cambridge. And even though, you know, we're swept up in this whole thing too, you can credibly say, we make every effort to do it differently here in Cambridge. And so,
sorry, Commissioner, John Keller, who writes for the Globe, basically concluded that while everybody but the president has a platform and ways that we can address issues within police departments, new policies, etc. But he says that the same happened after Ferguson. And now, these several years after Ferguson, all of these efforts at reform died at the hands of police unions and their lobbyists. So none of the change that was thought to come from Ferguson in terms of change either structurally or different requirements of behavior, et cetera, they didn't become a part of the codes that can be enforced. So I want to say to Councilor Decker, Councilor Decker is a great union leader, and I want to say I'm from Detroit. I have a deep UAW background. Councilor Decker, how can you, with your great relationships with everybody, maybe help them, help you, help us, help the society, if that's a fair question?
Yeah, well, thank you, Ken. As a counselor and as a legislator now, I think the role is, I think about this, and I have over the years, as it's well known, I have a really long history with organized labor. As a city councilor, as a state representative, the police unions, I've never had a relationship with. And I've always found that interesting. I've never made an effort, but they've never made an effort. And as someone who's been very identified with labor, I was just put a pin in that it was interesting. I think what it comes down to is that that's my job now as a legislator, right? Is to be thinking about what are the laws that we actually need to change and create so that unions actually, police unions that want to be obstructionists and don't want to be reflective and don't want to look to best practices that empower their members to do their job safely. And again, most police officers want to serve and protect their community. So for me, this whole question has been about looking at who's serving. Are they there for the right reasons? And I think our DA, said that really clearly about, being asked those questions. And if you feel flustered, then maybe this isn't the right job. But really understanding, so part of it's about who comes on the job and what that vetting process really is, what that training and the expectations really require, and what the consequences are. And that's my job as a legislator, to make sure that we are enacting laws that don't rely on the collective bargaining and the goodwill of union leaders anywhere. So I think, and most unions actually understand that. I think that they are an outlier. Most organized labor is actually trying to figure out ways that protect their members and allow them to do their jobs as safely and be valued. When I watched that Twitter, take place with DA Rollins, and I thought, are you kidding me? Like, are you kidding me? Like, this is what everyone thinks of you guys, and you're just confirming that is, believe who you are. And so I think that, so my job is to make sure that there's no room to negotiate something differently, and that whether it's a use of force or duty to intervene or certification, decertification, or data collection on police violence that is seen through the Department of Public Health, those are the things that we make a difference, so that people who actually come to the police department for all the right reasons. I too, as you know, not only have I served in this community with so many amazing police officers, I've also seen a lot of police officers just like give up, right? When they're actually the best of who they are is not being supported by the union, is not being supported by political leadership, and they're not being given the opportunities to serve in the way that they thought would strengthen their community, because many of them come from the community they want to serve, but not all. And so I do think that is where our job is to take that away. And whether the unions come along or not, who cares? They will eventually be there, because we have to change the laws, and there'll be enough consequences that many of their members will be doing the right thing because they want to be doing the right thing, and they want to serve and protect communities, and they want to continue to feel honored and respected in their communities. And rules and consequences allow us all to have the same expectations, regardless of how we feel or what we're trying to work out through this profession in life.
Can I say one thing just about, and then I promise I know you have one question, but licensure, just for the listeners or viewers or whatever people are doing, however they're taking in this information, 160 plus different trades, you have to have a license, right? I'm a lawyer, I have to be licensed. Barbers have to be licensed. Electricians have to be licensed. It is shocking to me that we are one of two states, I think, Representative, that doesn't have a licensure requirement for police officers in the United States of America. And so again, police have the authority to legal and lethal authority to kill, and they aren't licensed, right? I have to renew my bar membership every year, and answer some questions before I do it. Barbers have to put in more time, and they can only give you bad bangs and bad highlights. They can't kill you, but they have to get a license and the police don't. So I will also say, I have heard though, that the morale in the police right now is very, very, very low. And what I'm saying is we are holding you to a high standard because your job is so honorable and important. And I have an uncle, 30 years state trooper. My father was a former corrections officer. Every man on my father's side of the family is a veteran and has, many of them served in law enforcement. Deep, deep respect. But because of the power you have, we hold you to a high standard. And that doesn't mean we are anti-police. We are anti-police brutality, and we are holding you to a high standard.
Really quickly.
I just wanted to, Richard, can I just say, I've also talked to a number of Cambridge police when I've been out recently in the streets, and I gotta tell you, morale might be low, but a lot of, at least the police officers that I know, and it says something about who I know and who I'm talking to, they also 100% get what this moment's about, right? They do, and they're like, look, I'm here to serve and protect. And so I think that there's a lot of police officers who understand what this moment's about, what has gotten us there, and are far more supportive. And I get that I'm in a little bubble here, but that are more supportive about looking at these changes. And it's not about them, it's about protecting everybody.
I think that's fair. Commissioner, really quickly, because I want to jump you in right after DA Rollins, who has to move to the national conversation on this same issue. Really quickly. So, DA Rollins, you know, Cambridge bred, went to Boston, you're doing great things, we're proud of you, but it would be remiss of me, and I know Councilor Decker brought this up, but Yuri Stamps, to most of us who know him on here, I know that Mayor Reeves and Representative Decker and many of the people who were on this call knew Yuri Stamps. He was a gentleman amongst gentlemen. He was a friendly guy. I don't believe he had any criminal record. He raised his kids. We grew up with his kids. He was loved by all. And as Representative Decker said, he wound up dead on his face at the hands of the Framingham police. And Jerry Leone at the time, who was the DA, and I think we've talked about this, the DA is probably one of the most powerful positions, even though people don't know about it. He declined to prosecute. Can you just talk before you leave us a little bit about your kind of sort of philosophy or your feelings about holding police accountable, understanding that you do have to work with them each and every day?
Sure. I've tried desperately, and I would love to hear the commissioner's point of this. Our relationship is very bizarre, right? So the majority of the time, I am locked arm in arm with the police, walking into court. They are very frequently our witnesses for a lot of the crimes. They are the ones, of course, that arrest, right? We don't arrest people. The police do. They then bring a police report and a complaint, and we look at it and see if that police report has probable cause to sustain all of the charges that they're saying happened, all the crimes they say happened. But it's me with my license that has to stand up in front of a judge and say, Your Honor, we're charging Kenneth Reeves with the following 5 things. And then the police officers are usually our witnesses. But my job is to, one of my many jobs, prosecute crimes. It does not matter who commits them. And what we've seen, unfortunately, Richard, is when police commit crimes, DAs usually bend over backwards to either willfully look the other way, as we've seen in Ahmaud Arbery, or even with the DA with respect to Derek Chauvin, right? Took several days, and before just owning up to himself, tried to disparage Marilyn Mosby and say, I don't want this to be a Freddie Gray situation. Charged Derek with 3rd-degree murder. And then the Attorney General had to come in and bump it to 2nd. And now that we know that Derek actually knew George Floyd, I'm interested in seeing whether or not it's going to be upcharged all the way up to a 1st-degree murder. They might not do that because you get the same result potentially if it's a 2nd or a 1st, but we can talk about that later, right? But for me, I have told the police, and I said this to the Boston Police Patrolmen's Association, because of course, I ain't, to quote Bone Crusher, I ain't never scared, and I will never back down from a conversation. I went into the BPPA for about a half an hour, 45 minutes, was there for over an hour and a half, answered every question. But I said to them, if you aren't racist and if you don't use excessive force, we're going to get along incredibly well. I'll be one of your favorite DAs. I will stand up and defend you. This melanined face will be saying to the community, no, Commissioner Bard was reasonable and justified. Your loved one shot their gun at the police, and in protecting the community and themselves, they returned fire. And yes, it is a tragedy that he lost his life. However, it was justified and reasonable. That is what you want. But when I see that you are lying in police reports, when I see, you know, when we see, for example, the MBTA police officer right now, I want to uplift the superintendent Richie Sullivan's in the world. I didn't know about what that officer did to that homeless man on the bus. The transit police self-reported that to the DA's office and said, we don't stand for this type of behavior. They didn't go through the internal affairs process to then be bumped to anti-corruption, to then possibly be bumped to me. They jumped right over those 2 steps and brought it to the DA's office. That's why we are investigating. And if we have upstanding men and women in blue, they're not going to have any problem with me. But if you are breaking the law, we are held to a higher standard. Like when I see that Derek Chauvin had 17 infractions, Commissioner, on his record, I have to look at that police chief and say, what is going on here? When we find out that Travis McMichael's father with Ahmaud Arbery worked for 2 decades as the chief investigator for the DA and had not been certified, had grossly, failed in his position, but was able to keep his job. We have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. And we look like we are crazy, quite frankly, to the rest of the community when we have people with 6 open internal affairs investigations who then the same police department is giving them a commendation for the very thing internal affairs is supposed to be investigating about. Stop. Right? I'm still a human being. I might be the DA, but I can smell crazy from a mile away. We need to be better, and we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard.
Commissioner Bard?
So when we talk about unions, you know, I have to speak truth about the unions in Cambridge. They're actually refreshingly apolitical, which is different from the environment that I come from. And, you know, while I've done certain things that I thought would build trust, such as putting the civilian in charge of our professional standards unit, the unit charged with investigating reports of, complaints against police. I thought that it just helps increase our legitimacy to have a trusted civilian, sitting over top of that process rather than a sworn officer sitting over that process and investigating the behavior of sworn officers. And while they initially griped, when I sat them down and I told them the benefit of doing it and how it, would help us with being perceived as legitimate and trustworthy to the community, they stood down. When I initiated the procedural justice section that would, ever vigilantly monitor for racial profiling and racial disparities, they did their due diligence, asked questions, but when I explained to them how it protected their members and how it, also help build trust with the community, they, accepted it without protest. So yeah, now don't misunderstand me. The presence of a bargaining unit and negatively impacts my ability to administer the department, but I've seen differences in the unions here in Cambridge, both the Superior Officers Association and the Patrol Officers Association. So it's a weird little place.
We'll accept that, Commissioner.
I
think there was another part to the question, but
so
over the time
ago. Was just about, and we'll just move along. So let's just look at the issue of qualified immunity, right? So one of the, and to Councilor Reeves' point, Mayor Reeves' point, President Reeves' point, he has a lot of names, but to his point, in the Senate, in the House right now on the federal level, it seems like they're going to be an impasse in the 2 bills. One on the Senate side, I believe, is sponsored by Tim Scott, and the other by a whole host of Democratic sponsors. It looks like because of the issue of qualified immunity, because of the issue of banning chokeholds and the nuances of the language, it looks like that may fail So I want to just get your perspective on qualified immunity. As I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, one of the things, and I think the model is the Colorado model, is that it's mainly a civil discharge. And so for me, I believe that a police officer, and this is similar to Rachel, I believe that a police officer is a police officer until he commits a criminal act, and then he's a criminal. And so if you believe that, and maybe you do or don't, and I just want you to give your perspective. I think there's a difference between having a civil liability and qualified immunity versus saying you're now open to whatever prosecution happens. Chime in anything.
So if I can start, because then absolutely. I would ask the lawyer to clarify things for us. So I've always, and I haven't done my scholarly research on it, but I've always thought that qualified immunity protected against behavior that wasn't clearly established as running counter to the law, meaning that, you know, after the passage of the Patriot Act, how we handle folks who we branded as terrorists or whatever, I can't think of the official term right now, but I've always, and then although it's long established now, like how we handle individuals who were videotaping officers during the performance of their duties, although it's well established that they can now, at some point years ago, it wasn't. So I've always thought that qualified immunity protected against behavior that was not clearly established as wrong, like a knee on George Floyd's neck for a minute, for 2 minutes, for 3, that's clearly established as wrong. It runs afoul of any training that we have, and it's clearly established. So qualified immunity wouldn't protect him in that instance, and the way I've always understood it. And I've been meaning over these weeks, these busy few weeks, to, you know, do my due diligence in the scholarly research of it, but I got, you know, a local expert in it, so I'll defer to her.
Well, so I think one of the things that I saw about qualified immunity on the national scale, right, is that it basically, the courts have created something that effectively immunizes law enforcement officers from a civil lawsuit unless a prior court has it clearly established you can't do this. So, Commissioner, even if you guys had internal policies, right, there could be a savvy lawyer that says, okay, you're right, that's fine. However, if I'm going to file a 1983 claim in the U.S. District Court in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the Moakley Courthouse, not Moakley Courthouse, right? And you know, down in the Seaport.
You already put me in jail. I'm sure they won't.
I'm going to put you back in jail. Hush. All right. So, but unless there is some other case, Commissioner, that says, you know, 7 minutes is too much, then of course 8 minutes and 46 seconds is too much. But what we need to recognize, guys, is whatever happens with qualified immunity, we're going to see how that works. But mayors and city managers have tons of power in this circumstance. So, for example, Boston Police Department, $414 million budget last year, not including the $60 million that they have for overtime. If Officer Bard got a judgment in federal court that was a $7.9 million judgment that the city of Boston had to pay, if the mayor looked at Commissioner Gross and said, okay, you want to keep Officer Bard? Next year, your budget is $407 million. You're not getting any more money. That's coming out of your budget. Or if Officer Bard knew that his vineyard home, his house in Weymouth, because of course, Officer Bard doesn't live in Suffolk County. He lives in Weymouth, but that's another story, right? We could put liens on all of your properties and your trucks and your boats or whatever else you have. That is a quick incentivization to not engage in bad behavior when you know that you could be held personally liable. I think certainly there's still sexual harassment, but for those of us that remember when managers and supervisors could be vicariously liable with respect to sexual harassment complaints, and this sort of willfully looking away and pretending that we didn't see that Representative Decker keeps harassing Mayor Reeves and doing this, and we just all get uncomfortable and look the other way, right? If that's If I'm Representative Decker's supervisor and I look the other way, I could be held just as responsible as her for that behavior. That immediately culled a lot of that bad behavior. Of course, is there still sexual harassment? Yes, but that's how I want non-lawyers to be thinking about qualified immunity generally, but also knowing that mayors and city managers have the power to do that immediately when they look at their budgets, and they need to get a spine with respect to some of their commissioners and chiefs and the bad actors there.
And just to be clear, I'm in favor of doing anything that raises the cost and puts, holds us accountable and put checks.
All right,
So,
but I have to go get
that's
beautified
what it
for
does.
I have to go get beautified for my next event. So
You're already there, if you don't mind me
at
saying.
least just for a minute, thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Mr. Harding, and thank you, Representative. I am honored to be speaking with you. You know, Cambridge pulses through my veins and was just there at my mom's earlier today, but it is an honor, particularly Commissioner and Representative, to be in this moment with each of you. Because we are in a moment right now. This is our civil rights movement, and we are going to get this right. And to these two handsome gentlemen, thank you for your time and letting me be involved. Not you, Commissioner. I'm talking to the mayor and Mr. Harding.
That was
right?
clearly understood. Have a good one, Madam
Rachel,
Diaz.
we're so grateful for
It's
you.
our pleasure, and we couldn't be more proud of you always. And we're behind you 1,000%. So,
All right. Thank
So
you, guys.
grateful for your
No.
leadership.
much fun.
Representative Decker, just to you, if you want to just lend us a little bit of what's going on at the state level. I know that recently in the paper, we've witnessed Governor Baker, particularly, who I think he stepped out in front, but I know our good friend, Representative Miranda, also sponsored a bill on your side in the House. But if you want to just speak a little bit about your perspective on sort of police reform from the state level, I believe Councilor Baker took some hits because there was some incentives involved, and maybe you can help us better understand that from where you sit at the State House.
Yeah, I'm going to say I'm not paying too much attention to the specifics of Baker's bill, because we've got some really good bills right now being led by the Black and Latino caucus. And where we need to strengthen those bills, we will do that in the legislative process. I did hear also this idea that he would incentivize people to go through. Now, again, I didn't go deep dive, but it was to incentivize like a $5,000 bonus to go through anti-racist training. Like that's crazy. I would say, I'm sure that the Commissioner Bard would be happy to contract out to him with the training institute that he has created through his work and the Institute of Race and Justice at Northeast. So I would say that there's, I think the good news is that there are bills that were sent to study that are now back in play, right? And those are bills from looking at commissions on systemic racism, looking at policing, and then there's actual legislation. So there's 4 bills from the Black and Latino caucus that came out collectively. And then there's this other larger omnibus bill that's supported by the caucus. And it just came out after the caucus had already put out its release with Representative Liz Miranda. And I want to say I'm so proud of my colleagues and grateful for their leadership on this in this moment. And I also, again, I want to thank Commissioner Bard because he also looked at the language of this bill. I've worked very closely with my colleague, Representative Miranda, in supporting her bill. And I wanted to make sure that I absolutely would turn to the commissioner who I trust and whose values I trust and experience and say, what do you think of this? And he was able to work with her and some of the advocates around the bill and said, wait a minute, there's a few things that you want to look at because you want to make sure that the intent here that you're trying to get actually, that there's no slippery slope or I don't know, any policies. What? Wiggle room. That's right. And so again, I want people in Cambridge to know that we have a commissioner who really has been an incredible resource in weighing in with legislation and looking at language and making improvements to strengthen it to get to the things that we want. So I'll tell you about the process, and then I can tell you a little bit about what's in some of the bills. So the process is one that in a non-pre-pandemic world, we would be wrapping up right now. We would be moving into the final chapter of our budget process and wrapping up a formal session in July. So we'd be doing the budget. And today, in fact, we did a $1 billion supplemental budget. This is our second time coming together to legislate. So legislating together means that you have 160 House members, at least in the House, who are getting on the phones. There's about 10 phone lines that divided up between all of us. And we are trying to legislate by way of phone. And that's because there are legislators who live in districts that do not have internet access, which is why we're not doing this. And so this bill has been put out. It has been sent to, I don't know if it's officially sent, but I know that the Chair of Judiciary has been working and meeting with the Black and Latino Caucus and Rep. Miranda on this bill. I know that they've met with Speaker DeLeo and they've gotten a lot of support and positive response of like, let's do this. So in this moment, we are trying to seize the momentum of what legislation can we fast track that really speaks and acknowledges that this moment is unprecedented. And the moment is, I think, is a reckoning, not for my Black and Latino caucus colleagues, but for the rest of us who are predominantly white, a reckoning that showing up to a rally is not enough. And we really need to be showing up with, you know, pens and bills in hand that are ready to sign. And some of the stuff that I've talked about earlier, it does look at the issue of use of force. It would obviously banning chokeholds, but also looking at the intent of the severity of force. It looks at duty to intervene, and you know, a lot of what's been listed in that 8 can't wait, where Cambridge has already met the 8 can't wait, and I know that that's a beginning for the commissioner. It's not the end, but a lot of that is looking at how to also promulgate that in the legislature. Looking at the issue of licensing, so people are watching this, you'll either hear licensing or certification versus decertification. And that really, for me, the best I understand it, that's a wordsmith game about who's comfortable calling it a license versus certification. But the idea is right now that police officers, like DA Rollins talked about, are potentially facing the idea that they will actually have to be certified or licensed by the state to be police officers, which means when you get a license, that is a privilege. And not everybody agrees with what privileges mean in terms of licenses in the state, but that it is something that the government gives you. It's something the government can take away from you. And there's also in there the ability to do data collection, the ability for the Department of Public Health to be involved. There's calls for having the Attorney General, actually, hi Greg, for the Attorney General to also be involved in this. And I think those are going to be ongoing conversations about what oversight will she be involved in terms of looking at data and looking at actions. And so I think that we are really, I'm excited about the momentum of taking some really big concrete steps. I also want to be very clear, this is a beginning. And every bill that we look at, both in terms of looking at reforms, I think, Richard, you're the one that talked about Ferguson earlier, or maybe it was Mayor Reeves who we talked about, you know, the momentum around Ferguson. It really is coming to, I think we are in a moment, and the perfect storm is that people are home, they have more time, and the level of anger and frustration for people to sit there and see what happens every day to people of color in this country. And hopefully this momentum and this intolerance, and I feel really hopeful with a younger generation of people that are just done waiting for us adults to get it right, done being told that it doesn't happen overnight. And that momentum combined with the pandemic, combined with the fact that the people who are the sickest and who are dying in larger numbers, both in our city and in our country, our state and our country, are Black and brown communities. And so all of this is interconnected. And so I am seeing the hope and the possibility that we are going to, through this completely horrific moment that some of us collectively are experiencing, that we're going to come out with a very different kind of society that everybody deserves, not the one that we have.
Richard, I think we have to move to the touchdown for our first audience.
No, I think we're going to go to the commissioner on this last question. So,
okay.
Commissioner, really quickly, because I think the Suffolk DAs touch on it, but I think people are interested in what Cambridge is doing. You know, I understand you're a big shot around here, and you're one of the foremost authorities on police reform through your education in the places that you've been. So I just would want the people of Cambridge to hear about what are the things Cambridge is doing as far as the reforms. And I know that Representative Dector talked about the 8 can't wait, but legitimacy, de-escalation, duty to intervene, all that stuff. Can you just give us in maybe a couple of minutes what you're doing there before we move to the community questions?
So, yeah, thanks. So a while ago, about a decade ago, a little more than a decade ago, the Police Department took a pronounced shift from being a legal-centric department, meaning that we gathered authority from statutes, to a community policing philosophy where we gathered authority from the community in terms of legitimacy. That caused the department to review all of its policies to make sure that its policies were as humanistic as possible, and meaning that it took the sanctity of human life and raised it above everything else. So then it was back then that chokeholds were banned and the least amount of force was required. Just everything that showed that human life was, to be placed above all else. Then the department took a pronounced shift at, making sure that the officers were trained ad nauseum on various things from implicit bias to procedural justice, and continually trained on these things, fair and impartial policing. One of the things that I wanted to do to advance that, and we're in the near end stages of doing it, is to see how that training manifests itself in our daily interactions with individuals. I'm a social scientist. I can't look into your heart and measure what's in your heart, but I can measure how individuals are treated and how you treat individuals. So through our procedural justice section that we started in 2018 and have been building, its sole purpose is to ever vigilantly, meaning constantly, not when somebody makes a complaint of racial profiling or racial bias or racially disparate police, but ever vigilantly to monitor our interactions with citizens to see what, if any, differences exist in how we treat people of different races. And then for that last stage of transparency, which builds into accountability, to take that difference, that number, that result, and post it in real time without any human interaction, so that whatever it is, and it forces you to deal with that. It forces you to, not once a year we make a report where we take some less than meaningful metrics and post it and say, hey, Cambridge doesn't engage in this negative behavior, which I don't think, as I review data that our department does, I don't think we engage in racial profiling. But guess what? If I ain't measuring for it, how can I truly say what we are or are not doing? So what this does is it tells you what, if any, difference exists in how we treat individuals. When you look at the vast majority of departments and they talk about racial profiling, they use something called population benchmarking. It's a simple concept where you'll say, and I'm just going to say I'll just say minorities. So they'll say minorities make up 18% of the population. When you review our vehicle stops, we stop minorities at 17%. Therefore, no racial profiling exists. But what it doesn't tell you is that when we stop a minority, we normally hold them for 45 minutes on average and only hold a non-minority for 7 minutes on average. It doesn't tell you that we normally stop minorities for minor equipment infractions and only stop their non-minority counterparts for serious, moving violations. It doesn't tell you that we search minority vehicles 30% of the time and search non-minority vehicles 2% of the time. And we all know that legally the justification for searching a vehicle rarely ever happens when we stop. We rarely ever have that legal justification. So it doesn't tell you a lot of key things. So what we do is we look at the 3 major components: the reason for the stop, the result for the stop, and the duration of the stop. We quantify them. And then once you do that, then you can make all types of different comparisons. And it's we'll publish that data on an aggregate, but obviously it's sensitive enough that if Officer Harding or Officer Bard or Officer Reeves is engaging in some questionable behavior, it allows us to intervene and make sure that that officer has the appropriate training, and so that we can ensure that citizens are always being treated fairly. Our policies at all times have to be protective of the public, but then also fair to the men and women who we ask to go out and enforce the laws. And if those two ever clash, then being protective of the public has to carry the day. But it's my job to make sure that we do everything that we can to be protective of the public.
We so appreciate that. So we're going to move now to the Q&A from the chat box that's going to be managed by our secretary of the NAACP, Aisha Wilson. So Aisha is going to come on and ask both of you some questions that come from the audience. Aisha?
Hello, good evening, everyone. Good evening, Rep. Decker. Good evening, Commissioner Barr. Thank you so much for being here. This conversation has been so enlightening. So many questions have been coming from the audience. So many questions have been coming from Facebook, the emails, everything is blowing up. This is definitely a hot conversation. So thank you all for being a part of this. And DA Rawlins, thank you for being here and sharing your time with us today. I think just the question, just to jump this off, DA Rawlins talked about, thinking about the rotten apples, right, on the force, and what does this really look like and mean when we have officers on any force that have complaints, several complaints. What does this look like, Commissioner Barr? How do you intervene as the commissioner, as the head chief, in supporting your officers, and how do you diffuse what their complaints are looking like? How do you look at corrective action plans? What does that ultimately look like from your standpoint in terms of what the community then receives? Because when you think about the rotten apple, Derek Chauvin and what he experienced, having 17 complaints on his record, I don't know what those complaints were, but 17 is a lot, right? So regardless of what they are, how do we actually intervene and think about should this officer actually still be on the force or not? And I'll give you 2 minutes, Commissioner Barr, please. If you need longer, sure.
No, you said a lot. You said a lot of things there.
Commissioner, in your response, could you also tell us what is the case in Cambridge if you had 17 complaints as an officer?
So we utilize software to help us, because what you'll have sometimes, particularly in a larger department, where you'll have one officer who commits or has several accusations. I'm not even going to say whether they're founded or not, but has several accusations with Supervisor Wilson, and then moves to another unit and has Supervisor Reed and have, different allegations. And so they can accumulate these without one individual knowing. But we and a lot of other departments use a monitoring software that we set the threshold. So if 2 complaints are made within a calendar year or a rolling calendar year period, it requires us to review that individual's record and then to bring them in and then go over their record with them and make, and intervene when and where necessary. Long before, I've had occasions, unfortunately, where officers have accumulated a high number of complaints, and because some of the complaints were unfounded and because some of them were where you couldn't prove or disprove the allegation, it doesn't count as a strike against the officer. It's on their record as a complaint, but maybe only 3 of those 17 complaints are actually founded. And I've taken the stance where I don't care what the thing is, I'm not putting you around people ever again. And so I've taken them off of the streets and, had varying degrees of success. Sometimes we're our own worst enemy because we'll lose an arbitration because we don't document incidents and the minor occurrences. And so that when the big thing happens, it looks like it's the first time anything happened. So I've been real keen on ensuring that I'm holding supervisors accountable to make sure that they're holding the officers accountable for the small things, and you're less likely to have the big things occur. But we have an early warning system that we employ in Cambridge, and a lot of departments employ, that causes us to intervene when we have an officer who shows a pattern of behavior. You can set it. So you can say, if the officer has 2 use of forces, then I want to make sure that we talk about it. You can say if the officer has 3 complaints of any kind, then we're going to bring them in and talk about it. You can set those thresholds. But I'm actually a fan. It's easy to take action when you got somebody on videotape doing, having a transgression. I'm a big fan of looking for that eventually, like without a complaint being made. I want to know. I want to see what's going on, and then intervene and then. And so that's one of the reasons behind the procedural justice section. I don't want to sit back and wait till somebody makes a complaint that says that my department or particular officer in the department is doing something. I want to be able to look for myself and see and know So that's why we're monitoring. I started off by saying that we'll be monitoring the difference between how individuals are treated during vehicular stops. But then that same comparison will be made again for use of force to make sure that similarly situated individuals are treated similarly by this department when we use force and when we stop them. So
Thank you.
Hope that answered your question.
Thank you, Commissioner. This next question, I'll start off with Representative Decker. Why now? Why is it time now to revolt? Why is it time now for the protesting that's happening? Why does this feel different now when we have dealt with murders of Black men and Black women for years, you know, for centuries? Why now does it feel different that we are taking action?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we could all answer that question. So I think based on what I'm looking at is I think that I think the video is, you know, we watched a man not only die, but we watched law enforcement take a long time, right? It's a long time. I also want to say though, but it's not the first video where we've watched police brutality, where clearly it has been an issue of racism. So it's not the first time. So why this? I think it's a combination. I think that, I do think that the pandemic is part of this. I do think the fact that this pandemic has hit Black and brown communities harder than anyone else for so many reasons that are about structural racism. It is about health outcomes. It's about access to health care. It is about poverty and job security, and who's had to be more exposed and why, and the risks people have had to take. And so I do think that the same communities that have been disproportionately, and you know, disproportionate doesn't actually get to the heart of why that is. It's like sort of this kind of like coincidental thing, but it's not. It's racism, right? It's structural racism. And so I think that the pandemic, and people are home. So people are home, and let's be clear, right? Black and brown members of our community have not just decided to wake up to this, right? This has been like every day. I will say that the legislature, if the legislature, and I said this at the time, and the commissioner, I brought the commissioner in to help me work with some of my colleagues when we did the data collection for hands-free driving. If a quarter or half of the legislators were Black and brown, there's no way we would have passed legislation that did not include data collection for all stops. So we passed legislation that made some people safer while inevitably, statistically, making Black and brown people less safe, right? So I think part of this is about people also being home, having time, and this pent up anger of, and the reality of who's being impacted by this, having time. And young people, I think, have also just taken to the streets around this. And it has been young leaders of color who have been brought in by, young leaders of color who are leading a diverse group of people who are Black, brown, white. I mean, it's like the diversity of who's out in the streets. It looks like Cambridge to me, but it's looking like that in a lot of places that don't look like Cambridge. And I think there's an impatience and an intolerance that's growing, and it's what this virus is doing to us, and and in the same way, you know, I'll tell you, I struggled with going out to protest initially because we have been so focused with our family about, you've got to stay home if you can, right? We need to slow the spread. Take this seriously, social distancing, wearing masks, and these public health protocols, remember, in the last 14 weeks, they have slowly rolled out. We didn't start with wear masks and keep social distancing. And so we went from that to now people taking to the streets and struggling with like, oh my God, are we going to spread this infection to everybody? And so I was really, and I have a mom who has COPD, and so really trying to be protective of what I bring to her, because I still want to be able to help be part of her care. And then it was this like, but this is also a pandemic. This is also killing. So whether you die of COVID or whether you die at the hands of police brutality, people are dying, and it's not necessary, and we need to get to the roots of this. So how can I not only as an elected official, but as a mom and as a person who cares about and loves my community, how can we not take to the streets? and do it, and people are doing it as safely as possible. We're seeing, if you saw in Cambridge, when they tested 4,000 people in Cambridge went for tests based on those 2 free days. If you went to a gathering, a large gathering, you were encouraged, and Cambridge Health Alliance was part of the free testing around the state. So Cambridge came back out of those 4,000 tests at about 1% rate of infection, and around the state it was a little over 2%, right? So I think the point is that even at these large gatherings, people are being careful. They're wearing masks and they're keeping distance. But whether you die by COVID or whether you die at the hands of racist systemic systems, it's time to take it on.
Thank you, Rep. Decker. Commissioner Barr, what about you? What about this time in history seems fitting that we're doing all these protesting and that there's going to be time for change, or a moment where we're going to be moving towards change?
So we've seen it before, you know, a long history of it, and we hope that this time is different. I got my fingers crossed. I'm hopeful that this time meaningful change is made. I want to say that it has to be reform. I think we lose sight of the fact sometimes that police reform has to be police-led. And bear with me, I'll try to explain myself. I liken it to civil rights legislation. When civil rights legislation didn't pass because Black people wanted it passed, civil rights legislation passed because well-meaning people of all races wanted it passed, particularly the dominant culture, Caucasian people. So here in policing, the dominant culture are police. And in Massachusetts, I find you have some of the most well-meaning police chiefs in the country. And so I'm confident that we can come together in Massachusetts and drive that reform, you know, from within. Obviously, the pressure needs to stay on. But even still, I started off by talking about how we dropped the ball, how we missed the opportunity to be protective. Even all of these well-meaning chiefs, and there wasn't a whole lot of support for the data collection with the hands-free. So we met even the most well-meaning, highly educated individuals drop the ball sometimes, but we need to make sure that we are protective at all costs. That our policies are.
I'm sorry, I want to say that this is an example, because Massachusetts does have some pretty amazing police chiefs who I've stood with to bring transgender public accommodation civil rights to the legislature. They were right there as incredible allies and advocates. They stood with me when I tried to bring in the red flag law on, you know, common sense gun ownership to help reduce suicides and mass shootings. But I also want to say that, again, this is what racism is, right? They also, had they stood with me, had they stood with you, had they stood with my colleague on all data collection and understood that on the one hand, we were actually trying to help keep people safe from distracted drivers by doing something that inevitably, statistically, would place Black and brown people at the hands of more stops by cops. Yeah. So it is this. So it comes back down to even well-meaning white people still racist, and I include myself in that. Like, you can't be a white person and think that you're not racist. And my job every day is to undo that and to try to really struggle with, you know, where do I need to be more conscious, and how do I need to make sure that I'm listening to my colleagues and to my community who have very different lived experiences, and knowing that my instincts, which I always think are pretty good, are never going to be the lived experience of a Black or brown person in my community.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both of you. So the next question really talks about community involvement, and how do we get the community to really share and be in partnership with the police when it comes to what reform actually looks like. And, you know, I know through the city council and the police budget and all this stuff that's been happening across the country in terms of defunding police, but right here in Cambridge, where we know we have this unique bubble, but knowing that we are so progressive in how we move forward and how we do policing in our community, how are we actually looking at how we check ourselves as police, and how do we look at the advisory board and really think about how, as a community, do we get to weigh in and have conversation and dialogue with you, Commissioner, on policing and trying to reform the police?
So, you know, I say it all the time. We work for the public, so therefore we should be accountable to the public. So accountability really should look as close to as what you say it should look like. And if we can't do it that way, then I should be able to reasonably explain why something can't be done the way society is clamoring for it to be done. So whether that's more oversight, however that is, but I will tell you that when you increase the community, when you strengthen the ties in the community, you have so many benefits, not just between the trust relationship between police. So I've had the fortune of, misfortune or fortune, however you want to say it, of going to several communities where the police hated the police didn't trust the cops. I mean, the community, and the community didn't trust cops. And it was this siege mentality, this us against them mentality. And I've gotten out there and shown the officers how to build stronger relationships and how to increase police engagement. When you increase police engagement, community engagement, it increases as well. And you find all types of things. One of the benefits of that is that you'll see crime go down. It's just a natural side effect of having those strong community ties with the advocacy groups, with the community groups, with the Black churches. When you increase those ties, you have so many benefits. And when the officers see that happen and they see the relationship start to turn around, most of them come along with willingly. There are several who don't, and then those by virtue of my position, I can tell you what you're going to do, and I'm gonna win because you're gonna have to do what I have to tell you to do. But I'll try to show them the benefit of it. I remember one situation, the officers were complaining, well, we have the worst equipment, we get the worst. I said, listen, you can scream till you blue in the face to city council about what you need, but it ain't gonna matter until they say something. They be in the community. And they ain't dumb. They ain't gonna just say, they ain't gonna come to your aid or say it for no reason. You gotta show them that you're worthy of it and continue to show them that you're worthy of it. And when you do, they will. And they did. And they came and said, listen, how come our officers don't have? And then next thing you know, they got. So even some of them that don't come along willingly, when you show them the benefits of having those strong community ties, even if some of them are quasi-selfish, those community ties are key. And the strengthening those ties are invaluable.
I love it. I love the sound of that. And I think that that's critical in thinking about how you can, I don't know, if you're thinking about some town halls, with the community, with stakeholders to really hear their voice and have that help and influence what policing in Cambridge looks like. Thank you for that. As a social worker, this question was really one that was powerful to me. How are we looking at or considering a social work to prison academy pipeline? Is that something that could be in the works? So like social workers becoming officers, and what might that look like or be versus just someone who works for the department, but an actual police officer?
I got you. So at first I didn't understand the question. So yeah, no, that's key. We talk about the guardian versus the warrior. And then, we say we want the guardian mentality, but then we continue to go out and get warriors and then try to train them to be guardians, when the next logical step is to go get the guardians and then train them to be that momentary warriors when they need to be, So that's a process that we have to work around. And the Bridget civil service system is one of the impediments to that. But yeah, no, that should really be a thing. We should look to do more of that. And, I think you already know that the department does employ social workers who go out and handle all our non-emergency mental health issues and incidents. And sometimes they bring us along because because there's a perceived threat. But we should hire guardians and, train them to be warriors when they need to be. You'll find that more and more the need to be that warrior is diminishing. You still need to be able to protect the public from, the ills that are out there in society, but so many more times we're coming across somebody in the throes of a mental health issue, and we need to be able to help that individual and be, have training to help that individual, but then have the specialists of it readily available.
Thank you so much. There's a question that's coming up in the chat box right now, and I want to be, aware of time and you all's time as well. We've been on this call for just under 2 hours, which I appreciate, all of you. So how specifically do we achieve a qualitative different police department? Should we replace civil service? Should we deshallow arbitration? Should we require officers to live in the community as long as we make their housing somehow affordable?
That question is for me.
Yes, we can start with you, Commissioner, and then to Rep. Decker. Thank you.
So I think we could. It's an amalgam of all the things you said. All of those things would help. Civil service is an impediment. It was once a necessary tool, but now it's more of an impediment. We want to make sure the department is actually reflective of the community. And if anything stands in the way of the department being reflective of the community that it serves, now don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that an officer of one race can't dutifully police a community of another race. What I'm saying is that it helps to build trust and legitimacy when the community sees that the department is reflective of it and inclusive of it. So anything that stands in the way of that, we have to remove those roadblocks. If it requires officers having strong community ties, yeah, I mean, think of it this way. Would you trust a chef that wouldn't eat their own food? No. So
not at all.
Right, exactly. So you want officers to have that vested interest in the community that they work in. So yeah, no, I mean, it just makes sense. So anything that you can do to remove the barriers and impediments, we got to do it.
So I think Aisha, I'm sure you'll pop up again. I guess a couple of things that I would say about that is, because I've talked about this on this, and I've talked about this for years about, again, a reimagining like who gets recruited to go to the police department. And while there's a lot of amazing people who I think have, when people think about their best experiences with police officers, you think about people who are describing really personal relationships where they feel like they've been transformed or given opportunities, right? And so when you think about social workers, Aisha, I think about people who help transform people and give them opportunities. So whether it's recruiting from social work schools, whether it's also allowing police officers to get credit for going and doing continuing education, specifically targeting at schools of ed or schools of social work, right? I mean, this is some of that. And it also is about a de-escalating of the kind of enforcement we're expecting of our law officers. You know what else makes crime go down? Decreasing poverty, more educational opportunities, affordable housing. When people suffer less, crime goes down too, right? So I think there's all of that. And this idea that somehow, and I know what people are getting at too around sort of the housing piece, right? Let's just be clear, there are lateral transfers that have come into this community before people who've actually were living in this community. And I have seen some of them who've had bad attitudes and who, their social media ridicules the values of our community. It does. And I think if Cambridge is too progressive, too lefty for you, go to another community and get a job. But you like our salaries, right? I get that. Because in fact, we do understand, we do respect the profession of law enforcement as well as a lot of other job opportunities here and the benefits. So I struggle with this because I think it's really expensive to live here. And if we're gonna go down that path of requiring law enforcement to live here, there's gonna be cost of living, that's a reality, right? But because even $100,000 in Cambridge does not actually afford you a house, never mind staying here with the family. But then we're going to go down a path of, well, shouldn't our educators be able to work here? Shouldn't our daycare providers be able to live here? Or so that's another path. So I think that it is about, again, assessing who, really having a better assessment of who's coming in. Civil service is a big issue. That is part of a bill that's before us right now. And I think people have always been afraid historically to question civil service. And I'll say, it's not a secret to those who know me in this Cambridge that my dad is a veteran who served this country for 2 tours and was treated badly. You know what helps veterans? When they come home and they actually have a lifetime of health care that they can afford, when they actually have some kind of economic security to take care of their families and education and housing. Those are the things. It shouldn't be that the shortcut to those things is that you get in the police department. And so whether or not we do an alternating of 1 year civil service, 1 year not, I mean, to not tackle it means we'll never tackle the pipeline of who gets in line first to come in is either a lateral transfer or who gets into the academy first. And we have
I would like to say, I would like to say many of our officers do have strong community ties and ties to Cambridge and graduated from the high school. And, you know, families have long had houses here. They've been priced out, you know, quite frankly, of home ownership here if they don't inherit their family's home. But many of the officers do have, an overwhelming percentage of the officers do have strong Cambridge community ties.
So I have a bill that, just so you know, so I filed a bill that would allow people to still actually access, if you graduated from Cambridge Public Schools and you were 10 years out, you would still get credit and priority to come into our jobs. Because we know a ton of, all of us here who are, you know, born and bred, raised Cambridge, and then Ken is an adopted son of Cambridge.
Thank you.
And Commissioner, you're on your way, but your daughter already is now. I would say that, you know, we know plenty of people who live in Cambridge, they just sleep somewhere else at night. And so the other issue is, how do we make sure with people who have strong ties who can't live here? And that is a civil service issue, right? So I have a bill that would allow people to have 10 years of out of Cambridge to still actually have a priority to get back into jobs in Cambridge. Because when I think about our best police officers who know people who are beloved in this community, they are people who have strong ties to the community, because you behave better when people around you know exactly who your mom is, who your dad is, who your grandmother or your aunt, and have expectations of you.
That's one of the things that the cadet program helps us with. It helps us to put Cambridge kids in these public safety jobs and then the police department. And the city manager was very instrumental in bringing that back. So we actually had our first graduate of the police academy 2 days ago, last week.
Yes, congratulations to those cadets. Thank you. I have one more question before we turn it over to Ken. And I just want to ask this question about support, and what does it look like for our white allies and our co-conspirators that are out there? What are some things that they can do in support of, you know, policing in Cambridge, what we're going through, how they hold the most weight, and could support this movement so that it does not fade away?
In my opinion, you have
can I
to.
do you first on that, and then Commissioner Bard, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha, for that. I think one is about making sure that your leaders who are white are being held accountable, who are listening, and are actually taking the votes that actually make these things become law, because it's not just enough to show up at a rally, right? And so all of us who are in positions of leadership, and that's leadership of schools, leadership of elected office, but all of us who are white allies need to understand that it's all, you know, people talk about racism it's not right. Racism is a white person's problem, right? It is, you know, it's more dangerous. The toxics and the violent impacts are experienced by brown and black people, but it's white people who actually need to start like checking in with themselves and the systems that we benefit from, and figuring out what are we going to do to systemically actually start undoing those things and creating laws and consequences and opportunities, right? So I think it's speaking out, but also being a good listener, knowing when to step aside, knowing when to uplift, and also knowing that accountability is really also key. Doing things that have metrics that we can measure and that have outcomes, and being transparent about those.
Commissioner.
Beautiful, thank you. Commissioner?
Yeah, I'm pretty much what the representative said. It's about making sure that you consult those folks who are actually impacted, and making sure that what you're advocating for actually helps the population who you seek it to help. Don't assume that you know. Find out. And if you don't think that, you know, whoever you are in this society, if you don't think that racism is also your problem, you know, to deal with, then you're part of the problem. Racism affects all of us, and you know, not just black and brown people. It affects humanity, period. So it's everybody's problem to deal with, and everybody should view it that way. But I would just say, continue to advocate. Make sure that you do so in a way that doesn't detract from your message, and but actually find out. Actually, make sure that you're moving on something that the folks who are impacted, you know, by racism and by being over policed, make sure you get the input from them, and then advocate on those causes.
Aisha, can I just add one thing?
Yeah.
I also think it's important that white people take the time to start re-educating ourselves. We actually really don't know the authentic history of this country. And I think whether that's like, there's a lot, there's a whole list of books out there. Get on the internet, or follow some amazing people in Cambridge. But it's really, there's about really, and I know Ken will appreciate this. There's an intellectual component here that it's about re-educating ourselves about the real history and the consequences and understanding, whether it's understanding what redlining did, it's understanding that like policies and discrepancies and gaps in wealth and gaps in health have actually been deliberately created by historical context, moments, policies, and budgets. And it's incumbent upon us that we didn't just end up here. We got here because of choices that were made under our names.
I appreciate you so much, Representative Decker, for really speaking to that. And I want to say that in the fact that we actually celebrated Juneteenth, and we're seeing so many companies just nationwide that are celebrating Juneteenth and giving that day off to their employees or time and a half or whatever. And I work for the Housing Authority, and they're saying next year we'll be celebrating Juneteenth and giving
everybody
it off
will.
to all of us.
The
and
House just voted today to make it a law, a holiday.
I appreciate that. And so, 155 years in the making of really standing ground and staying true to what the oppression of how Black people have been oppressed in this country at the hands of white people have been really, a way that we have been oppressed and marginalized. And I just appreciate that today it does feel like something new as we continue to move forward. So thank you. And in closing, there was one piece that was in the Q&A that I just want to shine and put reference to is around social workers in the community and thinking like that is really a more white woman dominated field. And so when you think about even having social workers in the field, knowing that they will not really be Black and brown people. So really thinking about, again, how we are marginalized even in many fields that could be helpful and useful in our community. So that's all for the questions. I will turn it over to Ken.
Well, what an extraordinary conversation this has been. And I want to thank all of our panelists. I'm sometimes skeptical about where we are in the ocean on questions of race. I do know that the NAACP's founder, W.E.B. Du Bois, wrote a book called The Souls of Black Folks. And in that book said that the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. And here we are in the second decade of the 21st century. And the problem of the country is a problem of the color line. And so I like to think of the NAACP nationally, and I was very pleased that Rachel left us to go to a national forum sponsored by the NAACP on the legalities of now. And she is really such a powerhouse of progressive notions of how we can get out of the place that we're in. So I'm glad to know that. But it's the NAACP would like to go out of business. Really would like to, but we can't until we bring equity and equality for everybody. So that being said, this evening's attempt was to bring together our best minds and counsel together on where we are and how we must proceed from here to where we want to be. So I have to thank my NAACP team, Mr. First Vice President Richard Harding. You have more brilliance every day. I thank you. I think you're masterful in today's discussion. Our secretary, who I don't think we said, Aisha, is also a newly elected member of the Cambridge School Committee. You always do a wonderful job, and anything we do that's successful, your hands are in it. And I must say thank you to our treasurer, Kirk, who is a wonderful fire in our midst. And we have two members of our executive committee, Danielle Jones, who had so much to do with threading together our communications today, and also Steve Brown, who is a wonderful part of our multicultural reality. You know, this organization began as a multiracial organization, and I'm glad to say 112 years after, we continue to be. I did just want to mention that the NAACP nationally was to have had its annual convention in Boston in July. And it is now, it's not postponed, it's simply changed in format. So it will be in July, but it will be a virtual convention. And this will be something new for many of us, but the National NAACP has many town hall meetings like the one that is happening now with Rachel that have huge audience in the national audience, many of those in a year. So it's good to know that we will be counseling together, because this is a year when we need a national NAACP convention because things are in such a state. The last thing I want to say is that for me, the fact that George Floyd was murdered in the way he was murdered leaves written upon my heart that who did that could not have believed that he was a human being. And I believe that is the root of our problem, not only with the police, but in other spheres of the society. So I'm hopeful that we will move all people to the status of humanity and find love in all people. So that's a challenge. I want to also thank CCTV for there's a wonderful team there that has helped us to make this program possible. Mr. First Vice President, if you have any concluding thoughts, I'd love to hear.
No, I appreciate your words, Mr. President. As you said, you've already thanked everybody. I would just say this, that, you know, I am, as you are, and I think as we are as a team, I am truly committed, because while I understand that, as my high school classmate, Representative Decker, said, we are not immune to things that happen in the rest of the country. I do think that Cambridge has an opportunity to be a real change maker. It's going to take courageous conversations and courageous action. And I think with this commissioner at the helm, we are poised to be able to, you know, lead in this conversation in a real way, so that George Floyd, that never happens on our streets, and hopefully never anywhere else, but for sure not here in Cambridge. And I just want to remember DJ Henry, who also was killed at the hands of police, a young kid who's from our community. And so I'm more enlightened and more optimistic now from this conversation. You know, Nelson Mandela often said, everything is impossible until it happens. And so I'm looking forward to the day that it happens, where we have a, you know, anti-racist, anti-bias police culture across the country. But for sure, we're here in Cambridge, we have a police department that represents the values and acts accordingly to how we want to be policed, and treats everybody in a humane, just fashion. And I think with the people who are on this conversation and the people in our city, if we can't do it here, it's probably impossible to do anywhere. So I'm thankful after tonight's conversation, and thankful for all who participated. Thank you.
And stay tuned for more NAACP programming of this nature. We have to reach the people, and this is a great way to do it in these times.
Thank you. We're going to sign off now. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Marjorie, and thank you, Commissioner.
Yes, thank you,
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, guys. It's an honor.